So this and event will focus on the special issues of the International Development Policy Journal, and we'll have 5 panelists, and I'm very pleased to briefly introduce and to this and the panelists. The first one is Julia Buxton, and Julia is a British Academy of Global Professor in Criminology at the University of Manchester, UK, and a Senior Research Associate at the Global Drug Policy Observatory, Swansea University, UK. She is also a co-editor of the impact of global drug policy on women, shifting the needle, published by the Emerald Press in 2020, and several publications on drugs development and Latin America. Welcome, Julia. And the second panelist is Anne Fordham. Anne is the executive director of the International Drug Policy Consortium. I just heard about her, and she's now in the Thailand, and over the last 10 years, and has built the network from 30 to over 190 organizations. She leads international advocacy and efforts on drug policy and human rights, and is the chair of the Strategic Advisory Group to the United Nations on Drug Policy and HIV. She is regularly invited to comment on global drug policy issues in the media. She holds a master's degrees in human rights from Sussex University, where she specialized in human rights and harm reduction. The third and is also co-organizers and Khalid Tinasti. Khalid is the director of the Global Commission on Drug Policy and Research and a teaching fellow at the Global Studies Institute at University of Geneva. He holds a PhD in political science from the Catholic University of Paris and has had research fellowships at the Graduate Institute and Swansea University. Khalid is the author of scientific papers and policy reports with a focus on public policies and democracy and role of elections and international drug control policy. The third and the fourth, and from the Shanghai University, Dr. Baruah, my colleague in Shanghai University, is an assistant professor at history at College of Liberals and Shanghai University. He is also associate director of the Musto Center. He works on the history of drugs and pharmacies and its relations with international drug policy, public health and society. He received his doctoral and PhD at Cardiff University, UK, and before joining Shanghai University, was based on Center for Social History, Health and Healthcare at the University Socioeconomic Glasgow, where he's currently a fellow. He has previously published on history of medicine and drugs and the British Empire and India colonial history, and he prepared for his first monography, Empire's Forgotten Addiction or History of Opium in Modern India. And these books were published from McGill Queen's University Press, I hope in this year. So let's us welcome and all panelists. And next we will welcome Khalid for moderate the panels. Welcome all of you and all my colleagues and friends.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Zhang. And hello, everyone. Ni hao, and such a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, everyone that is joining us in Shanghai and in other places. I am with you here this morning from Geneva, and I am very honored and I have a great pleasure to be welcomed and with my colleagues by the David F. Musto Center on Drug Policy Studies at the University of Shanghai. We are very happy today to discuss with you this special issue that has been launched by International Development Policy Journal based at the Graduate Institute here in Geneva. And this is where we are basing the discussion and around, and we will have a panel today. We're very happy to have with us one author, Miss Anne Fordham, who is joining us, the director of the International Drug Policy Consortium, who is joining us from Thailand, and the co-editor of the special issue, Professor Julia Buxton. And we have, of course, with us Professor Baruah, who is going to be our respondent and help us into this discussion. So today we are going to be really talking about the interactions and the coexistence of both drug control objectives at the international level with specificities on regional, national discussions, but we will end vis-a-vis those interactions of this system and this control regime with the global development objectives of the international community that we have been all working on and following up for forever, most at the multilateral system. So just to go very briefly into the discussion, I would like to start this panel. And again, please feel free to ask questions with Q&As, and thank you for being here. I would like really to go to Julia Buxton, Professor Buxton, who is joining us from Manchester this afternoon in Shanghai, to ask Julia, as co-editor of this special issue, what was the rationale behind it for you? What was the thesis, the question? Why did you get to the point of seeing these perspectives of drug policies and development policies being either not working together or working together? So where does this come from? Thank you.
Thank you, Khalid. Good morning. Thank you, Professor Zhang. Very quickly, just in response to that, because obviously we're hoping for a broader discussion today. The reasons why I was very interested in working with you, Khalid, and our co-editor, Mary Chinnery Hess, on this special edition, a couple of reasons. Firstly, as an academic, it was very important for me to be able to work with colleagues who are also practitioners, who are working in the field, who are working in the advocacy and the NGO sectors. It's very, very important that we bring together people who are in the world of policy, academia, and who are working in the area of practice. So that was the real draw for me, was working with a cross group of people collaborating in this special edition. The second reason was because this special edition provided the opportunity of open access. This is very, very important for me. Any books which are published and sit on dusty shelves and are not read by students, by people with lived experience, by people engaged in drug policy is of no immediate value. So for me, it was the opportunity for working with cross-disciplinary on an open access article. Now, the main reasons here also is that it should not be controversial for us to say that drug policy internationally has failed. This is borne out by the statistics of the UNODC. It's borne out by the individual country statistics submitted in the ARQs. Drug policy has failed in its current form, and it should not be controversial for us to say this. Therefore, what we're also trying to do with this special edition is have a realistic approach, say drug policy has failed, and we need, as a community of activists, scholars, policymakers, to be having realistic discussions about what the alternatives are and how those alternatives can be rights-based, how can they can be development-focused, and also how they can address things like gender inequities. Okay, how can we have interventions that do good rather than just causing harm? So my final point here, just before we go on to the bigger issues about the development aspects, is that what we also really, really wanted to do with this special edition was to reach out to the development community, because there is such a huge gap between people working in drug policy and people working in development. We need to be bridging these gaps, and overwhelmingly because the big concern is that drug policy is an impediment to the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we need to be working together on these issues, and that was the real ideas that we had behind this edited collection. Thank you, Khalid.
Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you. When actually you have spoken exactly about the regime having failed to achieve its own objectives, and the data is there, that there's no supply reduction, no demand reduction, and no trafficking reduction, and the impacts there. And we're, of course, also addressing all the issues that are what is still called today as the unintended consequences of the regime on other development objectives. And you've spoken about such a key issue, which is people, which is getting into the development people and the communities. And we in drug policy field have there always been that difficulty of identifying the stakeholders and who has the legitimacy and who doesn't. And also the voices have always come from the ground. It always been a bottom-up approach as well for reform, etc. What we lived here in Europe, for example, in the 80s and the 90s. I mean, the issue is so complex that the special issue has been, we've been very lucky to bring in a voice and an expert voice on who are the people involved in drug policy and who does what in reality. And this is my question to you, Ms. Anne Fordham. And if you can share with us your views on who are the shareholders, the stakeholders of this regime, and to explain really to the viewers who are the people involved and who are the different positions and legitimacies in this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Khalid. It's really great to be part of this event and to be, further involved in disseminating this really important edition of the International Development Journal. Just to really, reinforce what Julia has said, I do think this edition is so important in really trying to bridge the divide between drug policy and development. I do think that drug policy has been, traditionally marginalized by the development sector. They haven't seen how drug policy reform fits within a development lens. And of course, from our side in drug policy, we have consistently and for a very long time restated how the dominant approach to drug control, repression, punishment, and punitive drug policies have been devastating for development outcomes. And I think, as Julia says, we're no longer talking about the failure of drug policies as if this is something that is controversial. We are at a watershed moment, I think, a very critical moment in drug policy where we're moving beyond the critique towards a genuine discussion and of what comes next. And, included in that, for example, is discussions around, what's happening in the cannabis market, models for legal regulation of cannabis, and hopefully in the not too distant future of also other substances currently deemed illegal as well. And, I think, as you said, Khalid, at the beginning, we mustn't forget about what the impact has been on people. And the impact on people of repressive drug policies has been devastating and extensive. And, in my contribution to this edition, I really tried to enumerate who were the stakeholders in terms of when it comes to drug policy and unpack that term, because I think, the term stakeholders itself is inherently problematic. It comes from the corporate sector, and it has allowed corporations a space in policy-making forums that intersect with their business interests, but kind of masks the power imbalances between different types of stakeholders who are at this table. And I think, we need to make a distinction between different types of stakeholders and actors within all discussions. And especially in the drug policy debate, there are people who are at the table because they are rights holders. There are governments at the table because they are duty bearers when it comes to rights. And then we need to acknowledge that corporations are at the table. They may be a stakeholder, but they have a very different entry point and may be driven by business interests. So that was really one of the things that I really wanted to bring to the discussion. When it comes to drug policy, of course, I also in the chapter wanted to talk about who have been the most affected populations, who are there as the rights holders. And it's people who use drugs, of course, who have been, dramatically affected by punitive laws and policies. It is communities of subsistence farmers who are involved in the cultivation of crops that are destined for the illicit market. Obviously, often, their livelihoods are directly impacted by very punitive methods such as forced eradication of their drug crops, just, without consideration for what alternatives will be there. It's a broader discussion, but I talk about indigenous peoples, women who are also dramatically affected by punitive drug control policies, people of color, people living in situations of conflict, which I think is also something that we need to address more in the discussion around development policies as well. And I think, I think it's important to note that across all these different categories, which is not an exhaustive list that I've mentioned, it is what unites people who are most often, who bear the burden, I think, of these repressive policies, is that they are often living in situations of socioeconomic vulnerability. And why is that? That's because the illicit drug market operates as a survival economy for so many people who have otherwise limited means of engaging in licit economies and licit markets for various reasons. And I think we need to acknowledge that, because they're already living in situations of vulnerability and then are doubly impacted by punishment and repression in drug control. So I'll leave it there for now.
No, thank you very much. And just before going to Professor Baruah and to ask him a question, I wanted to get very briefly to you, Julia. If you can, in very few sentences, we've been talking about throughout both your presentations and your discussions now and your answers, we have seen that there is many negative impacts. Of course, this is something that we need, that has been set and based by existing literature, especially in the last 2 decades, with all the data that we have receiving. As we said again, there has been a steady increase in production, in consumption, and in trafficking. There has been an increase in transmission of infectious diseases through drug behaviors, through drug use, and dangerous behaviors such as the injection with used material. We have seen also the explosion of over incarceration and the continuing and also the doubling of women in incarceration in the last decade, etc. So Julia, if you can just very briefly tell us, what are these impacts on the development objectives? Very briefly, that if you can give us a very small picture. I know this is the hardest question to give to someone, but thank you.
The hardest question, answer it in a few sentences. I think the biggest development challenges we have with the way that drug policy is implemented is that drug policy does not address the structural causes and the structural drivers of underdevelopment. The problem with drug policy, our colleague Dave Bewley-Taylor calls it whack-a-mole. It's whack-a-mole policy responses. And the challenge is that drug policy, very, very repressive, trying to eliminate cultivation zones, trying to eliminate the trafficking zones. But the problem is that this is channeling resources into policing, law enforcement, and security. And it's a securitization of drug policy, which doesn't respond to the immediate needs and interests of local communities. Instead, it's a response that is really geared towards northern markets and the demand in the global north for these kinds of drugs. So we have this major imbalance here. So the key thing for me really is just that drug policy, as I said, in not addressing what are the structural causes of poverty. It's impeding some of these central aspects of the SDGs around security, human security, sustainable livelihoods, gender equality. You're not going to have any of these things as long as we have repressive, coercive, violent drug policies, because they are fundamentally contradictory.
No, thank you very much, and I think that it's very clear from your response and that of Anne how the impacts of these current policies on the SDG 1 and poverty eradication are quite important and key. And we're very lucky to have with us Ved and Professor Baruah today, who works on the history of drugs for the medical use, so also on the scheduling and all those substances that are deemed both used for the medical system and in the recreational market as drugs or as psychoactive substances. For recreational purposes. Ved, just a very simple question. So how do you see this special issue and the discussion that we're having now in terms of its what it adds up, or does it work with the existing literature and the academic literature and the great literature on this issue around the world? Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Khalid. First of all, I think it's great to be here. It's nice to talk to practitioners, as Julie already said. Congratulations to the contributors and the editors. I think this issue and throughout the various chapters, the 4 parts, and it makes a great case of the interaction and the intersection between academia and policy practitioners. It I think talks to both audiences. I'm a historian of drugs, and I mostly work on the history of drugs in Asia in the colonial context. But my interest in public policy sort of debates, the contemporary debates, are primarily sort of focused on not just the essential pastness or the presentness of the past argument, but also the fact that one can see as a historian why certain things work. One has an innate sense often why certain policies work and certain policies don't. And when you look at the prohibitionist model from 1961 onwards, we can see that it's built to fail at various levels. And looking at sort of thinking about the presentations by Anne and Julie, and also looking and having read some of the chapters, I think three aspects I feel are quite significant in this volume. The first is an emphasis on the national. I think a lot of the chapters sort of focus on the idea of a national experience. And I think in the multilateral, global, international drug policy sort of measures in the last 50 years, the idea of national experience has often been lost. And I think that needs to be reinserted into this debate because every country has its own unique sort of aspects that are not always recognized in sort of global policy making. The other thing that I found very interesting is this emphasis on what has been termed development deficit in some of the chapters in the volume, and how drug policy has never really, and as Anne also pointed out, has never really addressed this. So we have seen the UNODC talk about crop substitution, but we've seen that doesn't really address all the complexities of these issues. We've also seen alternative development models fail. We've seen development-oriented drug policy in Thailand work for a while and then fail. I think these are important aspects that need sort of a more coherent sort of exchange between the development sector and drug policy practitioners and also the academic community. And finally, just to quickly sort of point this out again, is that I find this idea about sort of focus on the participants, the stakeholders, because Anne has already complicated that word. I'm not going to use that word. I understand the implications. So I would rather use the word participants. The emphasis on each of these sort of bodies of participants is important, right down from the indigenous communities, the marginalized sort of groups of people, right up to sort of the policymakers in the UN or the multilateral organizations. There needs to be more recognition that each of them has a role to play, and it has to work in unison. You cannot have policy measures taken in sort of silos. Yeah, so I'll stop here for the time being, and I would love to sort of hear more.
No, thank you very much, Beth. Thank you. I mean, and I think that you have reminded something that was really key here. And as a historian, and I think it's an important issue that you have raised up, and you said it was built to fail. And it is really about a system that has been built also, that something that we never repeat, a control system that has, of course, with private, commercial, cultural interests, etc. But it is also a system that has been built in the 1960s at the moment of social hygienism. It was also at a moment where border control was very different from what we knew after the end of the 80s, et cetera, and all those. So basically, it is also a system that is a cornerstone, as we would say, but a cornerstone that no longer is related to the reality of what it's supposed to hold. So it is about an outdated system and that difficulty of reviewing international law. But thank you very much. So just very briefly, a question actually to the three of you now, to Julia and most certainly Vet as well. Feel free, please, to talk to us, and Professor Zhang, Yong-an as well, if you want to join the discussion. So we can see here the big issues. I think we're not going back into the specific data and the numbers, etc., that could all found in the special issue that is put in the chat. We are really looking into this, and we see all the perspectives. And Julia and yourself, Bed, you have been saying all the different gender equality, poverty reduction, human security, human settlements, etc., all these issues where drug policies really make it more difficult. So again, this is a huge question for short responses. Where do the solutions lie, according to you and in your perspective? Thank you.
Shall I go first and just lay the ground for others to come in on this very small question, where do the solutions lie? I think the solutions lie in many different fora. I think primarily it starts with us having the conversations, realistic and grounded conversations, which in many different country contexts is actually very, very difficult to do. So I think solutions, first of all, start in creating platforms and opportunities for cross-collaboration, multi-agency discussion and work between people across disciplines. And as we said before, between scholarship and the applied and practitioner focused work. So I think that's primarily where it begins for me. Secondly, it begins with having drug control and an international drug strategy that is human rights based, which responds to the human rights obligations of states. And as Anne said before, which reflects the human rights values and treaties which are embedded in the international system. And so we have a system of international drug control, which responds to the basics of a rights-based international system. Then we're going to maintain this dualism between, on the one hand, criminalization and all of the violence and rights abuses that brings along. And then on the other hand, all of these kind of languages and dialogues around human rights. But the reality is that drug policy is a very good example of the gap between declaratory statement and implementation. And that's a gap that has to be bridged. So for me, those two things, broad discussion, but also we have to be realistic about criminalization. Maybe this is a point we can come back to later on. But one of the big issues that we were kind of looking at in the special edition was how far no other real meaningful reform can happen as long as you are operating within a paradigm of criminalization. Criminalization offsets all of the potential benefits of development or rights-based strategies. So honest discussions about criminalization, reaching out by all people who are involved in these discussions.
Thank you very much, Julia. Just before going to Anne, I think that this idea of this discussion on criminalization is really key, and it's even more key because we haven't discussed it here today. Sorry, Anne, but it is even more key in this discussion in drug policy, because not only there is unjustified criminalization, but there's disproportionate unjustified one. So up to you, Anne. Thank you.
Yeah, just wanted to sort of lead towards my solution, Khalid, which I think will just be, again, a part of the bigger picture and to complement what Julia had said, but also just two things maybe to respond to what Ved said as well. You know, really on the participation issue and the meaningful participation issue, this builds on what you've just said, Khalid and Julia, about criminalization, right? Criminalization is such a huge barrier to actually the meaningful participation of the people who are most affected, because obviously in this discussion, they are most heavily repressed and criminalized and stigmatized. So, you know, there's all these kind of, you know, structural barriers to their being able to participate in the policy decisions that affect them in being able to design solutions. That's huge, and we have to address that from the participation aspect. I think this idea that the system was built to fail, I mean, it's even more than that. It's an inherently racist system that was built on racist principles, that was led by colonial interests. And I think we have to increasingly bring that to the center of the discussion today as we start to unpack this and move away from repression and punishment and who it privileges within, you know, within countries as well as internationally. And also that's an important part of the conversation as we think about what the solutions are going to be. Because, you know, where we see currently moves towards legal regulation of cannabis, for example, that, you know, that is, I think, part of the conversation about what needs to happen next, you know, where the solutions lie. And this is going to be, and going back to something Ved said as well, probably a nationally driven reforms are going to pave the way for this. You know, when we talk about this elusive, the end of prohibition, it is not going to happen wholesale. It is going to happen, you know, probably much more at the national level. And, you know, of course, we haven't even got into the challenges of the international drug control system and the treaty regime, but I think increasingly we are going to have to support countries or groups of countries to somehow find a valve to temporarily break out of the treaty regime and move forwards with legal reforms, such as legal regulation, that currently is not permitted under the existing treaty system, so that, yeah, eventually there'll be a critical mass of countries which will then, be able to shift the international regime. But that is going to be slow. And also going back to the colonial interests, of course, there's an imbalance of power in terms of the countries in the global north that want to move towards legal regulation, and countries in the global south where some of the traditional cannabis growing countries are, for example, and their prominence and power within this discussion. So just to flag that.
No, thank you very much, Anna. And just to maybe give just a little precision, if you don't mind, that when we speak about the legal regulation as academics and as experts, we speak about the perspective of control. It is not about the perspective of commercialization. It is not about the perspective of pushing out any production or etc. It is about the legal regulation as any products that bear a risk or anything is regulated by governments. And we can see that in countries where there's no commercial legalization, such as Uruguay. So yeah, just very briefly, I mean, if I can, I still have a question for you both right after, but I would give now the floor to Ved. Please, Ved, go ahead.
Right. Well, solutions. I wish I had the answers to that. But what I can, I think, point out as a historian of drugs and pharmaceuticals, I think some of the lessons that can be learned from the pharmaceutical industry in history and the fallouts. And I'm thinking about the legalization of cannabis in, for example, Canada and certain states in the United States and certain European countries. And how that is linked directly to big money, big corporate interests. And I find it quite refreshing to see in this volume an engagement with that aspect when these policies of legalization of cannabis has actually marginalized the traditional growers, for example, in North Africa. And I found that very refreshing because I think that is something that history has already shown us with cocaine, for example, in the early 20th century. So I think although at some level it's welcome, these steps towards sort of decriminalization and wider access, but there are sort of these traps that are built into the system, which encourages sort of monetization of these commodities. And we already see that happening. If I can also quickly talk about way forward in that sense, I think it's about engaging with as many participant groups as you can. It's widening the fora for discussion. And also, yesterday evening, I was reminded about this. I don't know if it's sort of tangential to this debate, but a public debate on drugs in India, in contemporary India, happened about 3 years back because of a popular movie that came out, which focused on heroin use amongst sort of a certain class of sort of section of youths in a North Indian state. And that actually helped. So it is sort of these impulses for change probably can be found not just within academia or policy practitioners, but also a wider debate in society or sort of further engagement with society also probably is something that has not always been the case when it comes to drug policy.
No.
Yeah, I think.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. But as you say, it is never self-evident. Even when there is the data, etc., there's always a need to reopen the debate and really put it back again, and etc., and reconvince. Now, I have a sort of a final question, really, to all the panelists, to the three of you, and this is more specific. I mean, we've heard about so many different discussions here, and we know, of course, that the international regime has started, really, even if it was a non-binding agreement with the 1909 Shanghai Opium Commission. And so we also know that, of course, if there is a region in the world, is where three of you are, Professor Zhang, Professor Baruah, and Ms. Fordham, and Yong-an and Ved, you're there, is the Asian region. So I really wanted to, and also how, and you've spoken about the colonial roots of the international drug control regime. So here, I mean, I just wanted to ask you, as someone who is from North Africa and Europe, really from a very foreign perspective to some extent, and Julia Buxton can also join the discussion because Julia is a huge development and drugs specialist, is really, do you feel that Asia does concentrate today all, and of course, when I say Asia, there are so many different frameworks within, but do you think that drug laws that are so repressive and actually remain quite similar in all those countries because of their roots, etc., do you see them as, do you see Asia as the place, or the countries in southern, southeast, and northeast Asia as being the place where we see today all those real difficulties of drug policy and their impact on development? Is it because of that very repressive framework that we can see a lot of these negative impacts that we're speaking about, and their perspectives of reform, or is it, or is Asia living through the same difficulties as other regions in the world, as Latin America, as Africa, or facing as Europe, or as, you know? So to some extent, this is a huge question as well, but what I'm trying to get there is all these impacts we've been discussing, do you see them as being highlighted in a specific space where there are so many repressive policies, such as in the framework of, let's say, for Eastern, Southeastern, or Southern Asia, or even Northeast Asia? Or is it, are there any specificities there, specifically because of the history, because of the policies and the policy framework and the laws against drugs, or not? And I just wanted to say one thing again, and we've been speaking about this just on the legalization of cannabis, and what Anne, you've been saying as well on the participants. There's an article by Bewley Taylor, Yelsma, and Kay in the special issue that speaks specifically on fair trade cannabis and the models and, yeah, the farmers. Just wanted to remind that. So going back to my question on Asia, and I'm looking at you, Anne, specifically because, I mean, you've been following up all the discussions, of course, in Southeast Asia and different countries, but also what is going on in China in terms of harm reduction, also what is happening in India in terms of harm reduction and criminalization, et cetera, et cetera. So if you could just give our audience a view on where does the region really stand now, and is it the region really where we can see those impacts? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Khalid. And of course, I mean, the first thing to say is it's a huge region to talk about, and there's obviously huge diversity within the region as well. I think, you know, one thing that is, and something that we've been talking a lot previously, you know, in some of the countries in the region is, you know, around this tension between sort of drug control and human rights. You know, human rights is seen as kind of this Western imposition to some extent, right? There's a, you know, especially in some of the countries in Southeast Asia, you know, China, for example, are very resistant to this Western idea of individual rights versus the rights of the community. And I think that's very interesting because drug control as it's currently formulated is not seen in the same way, but it is also a Western imposition. And, you know, it's also been difficult to kind of raise that discussion and to challenge the existing narrative in many parts of Southeast Asia in particular, but I think, you know, also in China, of kind of drug use as a moral failing, which is, you know, really drives the response here towards this zero tolerance that has been a zero tolerance ideology. You know, I think we come back to something that, you know, we have to take serious in terms of the discussion of reform about, you know, how convenient drug policy has been as, repressive drug policy has been as a mechanism of societal control, you know, and we live here in this region in quite sort of patriarchal societies, you know, where there is a very sort of paternalistic attitude towards certain, you know, towards the population. You know, people should do their part for the wider community. They, you know, should not cause trouble. And if they do, then, you know, it's about the wider peace of the peace and the security of the community, and they need to be removed somehow from that. So I think repressive drug control has fitted very well within that kind of, yeah, patriarchal, paternalistic societal model, I think, to some extent. And I think it's, something also to say that there's some positive developments around the, traditional and cultural use aspects, which, I think we see again, sorry to go back to cannabis, but that's obviously where all the discussion is happening. Not to get into too much detail, but there was a vote at the UN, at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs in December, on whether or not to acknowledge that cannabis has medical and therapeutic usefulness. And it was heartening to see that Thailand, India, and Nepal voted in favor of acknowledging essentially the medical usefulness, therapeutic usefulness of cannabis. I mean, they didn't abstain, they actively voted in favor. And that somehow acknowledges that there has been, traditional use of cannabis in the countries of this region, that it has therapeutic value, and that's a really positive signal. We can of course link that to, especially in Thailand, the government seeing that medical cannabis is going to be quite a lucrative market, and the market is growing very quickly here in Thailand. So we can be a little cynical about it too. But on the other hand, these are countries that, especially Thailand, has taken a very sort of hardline approach, and to see them vote positively in this space is I think a good signal. And of course, they've very much upset some of the other countries in ASEAN by really breaking the ASEAN consensus on this issue. So yeah, it's a complex question, I think you asked, Khalid, but I'm trying to answer part of it.
No, thank you very much, Anne. But really, I wanted to focus on, the question was really about to see, and to some extent, how those countries that got in a regime that was imposed on them, to some extent, are now the biggest defenders of that regime, as you say, because it was a Western point of view, actually, alcohol and tobacco. I mean, if we see a classification system that is based on the addictiveness and the addictive potential of substances, and that we leave deliberately out of that classification system tobacco and alcohol, because commercially, culturally, they're very important for those who were holding the pen when the text was written, is something quite obvious in terms of the findings. So just, it's really about that. I mean, to some extent, when will the regimes and countries such as India, who has lost its use of opium, its mild ceremonial religious use, when as their perspectives for policy reform and for going back into a local thinking about it, really. And as you say, Thailand is starting to take also into its own hands, its own discussions and decisions on this ceremonial use. So just very briefly, before I go back to you, Ved, I wanted to know if Professor Zhang, Yong-an, you had any point of view on this discussion. I mean, I know that the research of the David Musto Center is also very much linked into the security issues, but I mean, please feel free if you want to join our debate and our panel discussion, excuse me, or we can give you the floor at the end to give us some concluding remarks if you wish to, of course.
Thank you, Khalid. Probably I could say something, and it's a very interesting and topics and questions. And as a historian, I could not give the recommendations and the solutions for the next step for the international drug policy, but we could learn from history. So and you have mentioned, and in the 1909, and the first International Opium Commissions was held in the Shanghai. But why? And just because Shanghai is the drug and addictions and the capital in the modern history of China. So in fact, and Chinese government, the science of Qing Dynasty and to the Republic of China and now, and each government takes different policy to control drug and abuse. And for example, and the Qing Dynasty and had taken the free and the drug and policies and pressures, and also have ever and takes legalizations of drug abuse and drug production and trafficking. And in the Republic of China, and the government and the national government takes and state monopoly and policies, but and the result have proved and all of the policies and is not success to control the drug abuse and drug production and trafficking. And there are more and more peoples select to abuse drugs. So it's a big challenge for modern China. So from history, and so I think I have and give suggest one we must and takes yes, Anne and Julie have mentioned that each area and each countries have different diversity and policies. They could not have a same and have same and policies, and just because and each countries have a different society, different situations. For example, I think not just in Asia, for example, in the Africa and in the Latin America, possibly, and just because the situations of the economics and cultures and other things, and they could take the different and ways to deal with the drug problem. The second, I think, and the international drug control system, and based on the United Nations, and has faced the big challenge and from the national and the policies. But we, from my side and my opinions, and I think how to keep the balance between the national and international system, how to find ways and to make the international drug control and system and effective, and not just we give the we just and crack down the policies, and just because we have there are many especially developing countries, they have no good and choice for to control, to deal with the drug problem, and especially I think they must face the drug and problem, not just the drug abuse, just because some and in some areas, for example, in Africa, and the drugs and sometimes it's a medicine. They must use this and drugs for the medical use. And finally, I think, and especially recent years, and Chinese government have taken more and more, and I think how to say that the different and ways and to deal with and drug and problems. For example, in Shanghai, we also takes harm reductions and ways to deal with the abusers and problem. So I think we possibly in the near future we could, Julia and Anne and Wed and Khalid, we could do something. For example, basic research, one global survey and on the drug abusers, and what feelings, what things, what considerations of the different areas and the abusers, how to think this problem. And another one we will, and the different other stakeholders, for example, and officials and authors and scholars, and we do a global surveys and to know what feelings, what thinking, and of the different peoples, different and countries, different regions, and to think about the international or national and policies. Maybe we could know, deeply know, and how we should go and for in the near future. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Zhang. Thank you very much, Yong-an. I mean, you're speaking about two very important issues, which is the national and the need for national policies to respond to the problems that they have, and that balance with the international, but also the flexibilities of these policies. Basically, I mean, yeah, and this is also the issue we're facing here is the imbalance between the national and the international. It is that straitjacket of policies that really impose one approach. And as you've said, the issues that we face are among the 10 to 11% people who have problems, who face problems when using drugs or have problematic drug use, which is, I mean, in our European terminology, we don't use drug abuse, but we use problematic drug use, and that could be for a variety of reasons, etc. So, of course, but because of this imbalance with the international level, it's very difficult to implement national policies that do respond to people's needs. I mean, again, to our dear audiences, if we're having with us 53 people in the audience. So please feel free again to ask your questions in the Q&A to Julia, Anne, and Ved, and Professor Zhang as well, and Yong-an as needed. And Julia, I would just wanted to ask you if you just to chip in into this discussion. So I just wanted, I find it very interesting and to ask you this question actually, and it is about the title of the special issue and conflict and coexistence. So I mean, drug policies and development policies are living together. Are we in peace or are we in war or in conflict to some extent?
I would argue very strongly that they are in profound conflict. I think there are deep problems within orthodox mainstream development policy responses as well, which is separate from the issues around drug control. But we can see that many of the ambitions and expectations of development strategy, the Millennium Development Goals, now with the SDGs, targets are not being met, poverty reduction goals are not being fulfilled. So I think there are challenges within mainstream development orthodoxy currently, and I would say in particular the emphasis in contemporary global development strategy on the role of the private sector. And I think this emphasis on the role of the private sector has in many aspects rippled into drug control, because some of the alternative development, alternative livelihood strategies that we're seeing proposed for some of these drug crop cultivation areas are very much premised on alternative development projects that are led by a private sector, which I don't really think is serving the role of a kind of philanthropic bourgeois middle class in many of these countries where we are seeing the private sector being brought into some of these development strategies. And this is in particular in countries where we have a very oligarchic, very small and narrow economic elite. So it's basically the state and this narrow economic elite working together in what we're being told is alternative development. But the reality is it's not alternative development, because it's not addressing political exclusion. It's not addressing grotesque and shocking inequalities of land. And it's not addressing fundamental citizenship deficits. So the key problem is for me, and this just goes back to the point that Ved also made before, is that so much about the kind of promise of reform from within drug policy, particularly as it comes to development. So around these issues of, as we said, alternative livelihoods, alternative development, don't grow opium poppy, grow tomatoes, don't grow cocoa, grow potatoes. You know, the big challenge here is that the drug trade exists because of the complicity between the state, political elites, and powerful economic interests. And until we start having conversations that also acknowledge the kind of political economy dynamics of drug markets, then we're not going to be really having feasible conversations about development either. So fundamentally, Khalid, back to your question, I see development and drug control as completely in conflict, but both of these policies themselves have their own major internal divisions. So maybe it's about us trying to look at how we can build links horizontally between sympathetic groups in development and drug policy. Thank you.
Sorry, I have lost my screen, so I don't know, I can't see you really, so I am just going to speak out from here. We have had a question from, just very quick question to you again, Julia, from Estefania, that is asking, what would there be then another regime, or an alternative drug policy regime? What would it represent? What would be its principles?
Okay, well, I can answer this very quickly so other people can join in as well, is that it should be based on a system which is actually premised on the harms caused, which is the point that Ved made before. There's a lot of work on this by people like David Nutt. So a system based on actual harm rather than the political construction of harm. And I would also argue it needs to respond to the sui generis, the very specific, this is the point that Professor Zhang was making before and Ved was making, the very specific context and conditions in individual countries and individual communities within those countries. So it's about moving away from this generic homogeneity in global drug strategy and towards slicker, more nuanced, sophisticated policies that fit with the needs of local communities. I hope that answers the question, Stefania.
Thank you very much. Just very briefly to, so that we can close up the discussion because we're getting into our end of discussion. So just very briefly, before we close this discussion, it's really about to give the floor to you, Anne, and ask you specifically as well. To some extent, as a practitioner, as a person who works on the ground and who sees all of these issues, do you really see any, let's say, do you see any major reforms, or do you see drug policy changing in the next decade and up until the end of the Sustainable Development Goal, or when there will be the implementation of the Agenda 2030 at the United Nations? I mean, we know that statistically, all the participants, as you have taught us to say, are in the regime are statistically, I mean, not numerous enough to be considered left behind to some extent, but those populations will be left behind, but statistically they will not be as major in national statistics to make it a huge issue. But do you see, but as we've spoken today about different dimensions and the little technical details that make it so hard to achieve development objectives, but do you see the drug policy is going into a reform in that sense, or do you see it going back when we see also extrajudicial killings in certain countries in Southeast Asia or South Asia, etc.? So we see both, because we've spoken about the reforms that we are seeing in the West, but so just your perspective as the person who is, because we're all to some extent academics. I am half like you, so your perspective really from the ground. Thank you.
Yeah, it's the $1 million question, and I think I've got less than 1 minute to answer it. But you know, we are seeing some, you know, important fundamental shifts in thinking about drugs and drug policy. This is, you know, decades and decades of advocacy to push the agenda from civil society, from affected communities. I think that's important. You know, I think we see growing debates around the world on the issue of criminalization and whether or not it's been effective or not in terms of reducing, you know, or eliminating, you know, engagement in drug use and in the drug trade. And I think that's the answer on that is very clear. The UN system as a whole, and, you know, Ved mentioned that earlier as a key stakeholder, has recently come out in favor of decriminalization of drug use and possession for personal use. I think we will see them continue to push that message out. We will be supporting them to push that message out to national governments. So I do see some traction there, and also in developing countries as well as in countries of the global north. I think the cannabis discussion is important when it comes to the development discussion. You know, we really need to consider, as cannabis regulation happens, how we ensure that those most affected by punitive drug policies in the past who have been engaged in the illegal cannabis market can be helped to transition into the legal market, whether that's traditional growers in Jamaica, you know, or whether that's, you know, people who've been dealing and been involved in the informal illicit economies in cities like in the US or in Western Europe, for example. They are also have been dependent on the legal cannabis market. So how can they be helped to transition? And I think that is, you know, that is where we want the development sector to join with us and have this conversation. I think, as I said at the beginning, it's a unique watershed moment in drug policy where actually there are some real opportunities on the table to design, you know, a different kind of regime, and it has a strong development focus. And we need, you know, we're not development practitioners, which I think is why we're trying to continue to open this debate with the development community. So, you know, I do think that is possible and happening within the next 5 to 10 years for sure. And other, sorry, just I don't think to finish on other exciting discussions that have really sort of broken apart, I think, in the last year, you know, around the role of police, you know, police violence towards drug using communities, you know, that questioning of law enforcement budgets, I think is very interesting when it comes to drug policy, and the conversation around decolonialization of drug control.
So just briefly to close this discussion, since we're running already 3 minutes late, I wanted really to take this opportunity, as Julia has also done at the beginning, to really thank International Development Policy as a journal for giving us the opportunity first to publish this as open access. I really, really wanted to be very thankful and grateful to all of our colleagues and all the researchers and practitioners and experts that have participated and have brought us so many new perspectives. I mean, we've heard today from Anne on the participants and on really demystifying what is a stakeholder in drug policy and really getting a better understanding. And we have many issues like that. I wanted to really thank a center like the David F. Musto Center on Drug Policy Studies at the University of Shanghai. Without the existence of these kinds of centers, we will not be able to develop these discussions, to bring together people from Switzerland, the UK, India, China, Thailand, and put everyone together in a table in a global discussion. We would not have the data, we would not have the evidence, we would not see what's happening. And thank you so much for having that center in China, which is very appreciated by all the people. And of course, my last thanks are for my very special co-editors and the opportunity that I had to work with Dr. Mercenary Hesse from the University of Ghana and Julia here. I'm not going to sugarcoat you. You know how I feel. Thank you very much for, for co-editing this issue. And also finally to all of our colleagues at Development Policy, International Development Policy for organization of this event in VED. And to all the participants for your time and for hearing us for an hour. We wish to have more questions from you, but hopefully we will continue our work with the center and we will have many other discussions in the future. So thank you very much, everyone. And I wish you all a good evening if you are in China or in the region, and a good day for all those that are here in Europe. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, Khalid. Thank you to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.